Welcome to the NBA Slate Breakdown for Friday. I am Jason Gillo here with Daily Fantasy Cafe. 9 game slate tonight, coming off, right before the New Year break, or not break, but break for us. We'll be off through the weekend through Monday and be back on Tuesday with Brent. Cheat sheets, everything else will be up as usual. But here to dive into tonight's slate, 9 games. We got Houston and Washington here first. Our kicks off at 7 o'clock. Houston obviously coming off of a bad loss last night, blew a 26-point lead to the Celtics here. Obviously, we start off on the away side with Houston. Harden, obviously putting up 60, fantasy points last night on DraftKings. Of course, FanDuel is a little bit different with the 8 turnovers, but for a guy who shot, 25% from the field last night and still put up nearly 60 fantasy points on site dependent, obviously a guy that we can build around. Washington, defense has been pretty solid this year. They're in the top 10 in terms of field goal percentage allowed this year. They're not allowing a ton of production in terms of fantasy, but Houston, obviously, back-to-back, I don't really care all that much. I do think Harden's a guy you can build around still tonight. Usage rate still through the roof. So once again, have no issues. As far as secondary guys on this Houston team, not really looking at the front court all that much. With Clint Capella out, you can continue to kind of look at Ryan Anderson as a guy you could possibly use as a punt option, given the fact that he is fairly cheap, more so over on FanDuel than DraftKings. He's 5,100 on DraftKings. That's not something I'm too intrigued with. That's kind of where I'd be looking just in terms of options, because outside of that, we're not getting a lot of great matchups here with this Houston team at their prices. Eric Gordon's a fine option with his usage continuing to be higher with Chris Paul out. Trevor Ariza, I know they were talking about the minutes trying to get cut back here. Still played 38 last night. I don't think that's going to be really anything that gets away from him. Washington does struggle against the wings. He's worth the flyer. But outside of that, it really is Harden. And then you're kind of taking shots on some of these value guys on this team. Overall, I think on a 9-game slate, you can make the case we're kind of just looking other directions because, yes, it is still a Houston team that's averaging 115 points per game this year. But on a back-to-back here against a decent Washington team that does play better against teams that are above 500, they're kind of just secondary options to me as far as everyone but Harden. So as far as Washington goes, I do like this team quite a bit here tonight. They are going to get this Houston team that is on a back-to-back. I think some of their price tags are still fairly solid. Looking at, obviously, John Wall, who's priced down just a little bit. We had the big game on Christmas. Has flashed some big games, but overall it hasn't really been all that exciting, I think, in terms of the season. But over the last 5 games, have no problem looking at him, 1.2 fantasy points per minute. Rebound assist numbers. Assist rate's been up, about 5% here over the last 5 games as well. And Wall's a guy that the minutes have been kind of trickling all around, but, with him being back from his injury, he's going to be fine. I think you can look at him a little bit more in GPPs. I think cash game serves better options, even at a discount price. Beal's the other one you can take a look at in this spot. Have no issue going to the well with him. With Wall back, it really hasn't hurt his upside all that much. He's still playing heavy minutes. At 7,200 on DraftKings for a guy who can hit 40+, and I have no issue going to that route because look at Houston, allowing opponents to shoot 46% from the field, allowing 105 points per game. This is a spot where I don't mind using Beal here. Don't mind using Otto Porter as well. I think he'll fly under the radar. He had a solid matchup last time out against Atlanta, put up 31 fantasy points. Have no issue with him here in this spot. 6,200 on DK, given his usage. It's been a little bit down of late, but this is a guy who, has hovered right around 1 fantasy points per minute this season. So Porter, I have no issue with. As far as the front court goes, Markieff Morris, you can take a GPP shot on. I don't love it, though. Gortat, it's been playing pretty mediocre this season. Had the big game on Christmas, but minutes have been all over the place. There's just other guys that I'd rather take shots on tonight's slate. So not loving Washington side all that much in the front court. Atlanta and Toronto, obviously Toronto in such a great spot here. Atlanta on the other side, still projected for 102 points tonight. Not really in love with these guys. I guess if you're kind of looking, Ken Bazemore is intriguing, just given the fact that we look at this Toronto side, they have struggled against shooting guards this season. 30th in defensive efficiency. Outside of that, though, they've been pretty solid. They're strong against small forwards. They're strong against point guards. I don't have a lot of interest in Schroeder on this slate. I don't have a lot of interest in Prince or really the front court of Ilyasova, Collins, these guys right now. So Atlanta's kind of off the table for me tonight. Bazemore is the only one I'm really kind of looking at who's been playing pretty well. Toronto, I do have all the interest in the world in here. This is a spot where obviously we can look straight at the backcourt with Kyle Lowry and DeRozan. Both their usage rates, Kyle Lowry's has bumped up a little bit here over the last 5 games, sitting at 23.5%. DeRozan, 28.5%. Lowry's obviously been a guy who peripheral stats have been there for him this year. It's kind of been a lack of scoring. He hasn't shot all that well this season, but it is a good spot. He put up over 40 fantasy points out last time these two met with 27 minutes played. This is a guy back-to-back 40 fantasy point games in 3 of the last 4. You know, he's been a little bit volatile, but, 77 on DraftKings is a really nice price tag for him. 8,300 on FanDuel. I don't mind that either. So looking Lowry, DeRozan, both quality options in all formats tonight. I do think you can take shots in the front court as well. Serge Ibaka has been playing well. Usage rate right around 21% over the last 5 games. This is a guy who's been producing blocks. Did struggle last time out. Only played 26 minutes, but has kind of been around 30 or 28 kind of last few. So have no issue with him. He's a guy who's still averaging over 25 fantasy points the last 5 games, despite that bad outing last time out. So at his price, you can look at him. Valanciunas, great spot for him just because I do like targeting centers against the Hawks. They're not a great rebounding team. They do struggle on the defensive front. They do rank 24th in defensive efficiency against opposing centers. Small forwards as well. They're in the bottom 5. Power forwards, the bottom 5. You're going to find these guys in the bottom 5 a lot of defensive efficiency categories. So I don't mind targeting Valanciunas and GPPs if you need a cheap center. Problem is his minutes are obviously kind of all over the place. We've seen a couple big outings of him over late, couple 30 plus, even 40 plus games. So at 4,700 on DraftKings, I don't mind going there. FanDuel, using him as a 1 center, it's kind of tough to do on a 9-game slate with other options and even other cheap center options. So more look to fade there. Chicago, Indiana, this is a good spot, good game to target. 2 bad defenses going up against each other. Victor Oladipo already ruled out tonight, so we will start with this Indiana side. That means Lance Stevenson's obviously going to jump into the starting lineup. He played 36 minutes last game, 16, 15, and 5 with 2 steals. Have no issue going back to the well with him. Still fairly cheap. He's going to be extremely popular play once again tonight. You can go ahead and go that route. As far as other options go, I think obviously Miles Turner is someone that I do have a lot of interest in, probably more so in GPPs tonight. It is a good spot. Look at this Indiana team. They do struggle in terms of rebounding. We look at their defensive efficiency stats, not great, especially against centers this year. So I'm going to be going that route. They're 30th in terms of defensive efficiency. Turner's obviously a guy who we have seen shoot up some upside games here of late. Had the big game against Brooklyn, had the big game against Atlanta. He's got a nice little matchup consistency here going. Did well against Dallas. So against Chicago, who, rank 18th in terms of rebounding, not a great defensive team down low. I think we can look at Turner, especially at DK 6,800. He's a little pricey on FanDuel, but I still don't mind him in GPPs. So he's a strong option there. Darren Collison played pretty well. Didn't shoot all that well, but still dropped 16 points, 7 assists, 3 rebounds in that matchup against Dallas. I don't mind going to him with Oladipo out. He's still not going to see a huge usage bump, even with Oladipo off the floor. But at 5,800, I think you can give him a look. I think he's a strong option in all formats tonight. I know Collison hasn't been a guy that we usually like to target in cash games, but I don't mind it. 6,300 on FanDuel, so you can go back to the well there. As far as other options go, though, it's kind of tough. I think it's just really those 3 for me. Thaddeus Young, Sabonis has all been kind of cluttered a little bit of late. I think there's better options on this slate. On the Chicago side, this is definitely a side that I don't mind targeting on this slate. Start with the backcourt here. Favorable spot for really Chris Dunn and Justin Holiday. I think both 2 are obviously viable in all formats. We look at Indiana. This is a team that obviously struggles on the defensive end quite a bit, allowing 106 points per game, allowing opponents to shoot 47% from the field this season. So looking at Chris Dunn, he's obviously had two back-to-back really great games, put up 50-plus fantasy points in that game against Milwaukee. He's been strong against Indy this season, averaging 35 fantasy points, shooting 57% from the field. We know those peripheral numbers are going to be there. The prices are obviously on the rise, but I think when you look at it, you kind of got to turn your head a little bit because he's been playing so well. So obviously had no issue there. Justin Holiday, if you want a guy who's going to kind of get you around 20 to 25 fantasy points, possibly a potential to get you 30. Holiday's obviously in play. Great spot to target the front court. The problem with the front court here is that guys have been kind of cutting into each other's upside a little bit. We've seen Mirotic be kind of hit or miss. He wasn't great against New York. Obviously got into foul trouble. Put up 37 against Milwaukee earlier just 2 games ago. But Mirotic is a guy that I think obviously you have the most interest in out of the group just because he's shown the more upside of Markkanen, of Bobby Portis. But I mean, Markkanen's still getting right around 20, 25 minutes per game. He just doesn't have that upside as the other guys do. Portis is obviously the cheaper of the group. He's been getting some run in terms of behind center minutes, but he's another one where he has a lower floor, kind of in the lower teens. So it's not too intriguing. I think Mirotic is the way you want to go here tonight. Robin Lopez is in a great spot. If you can get obviously 25, 30 minutes, I think you can certainly hit value like he did last game out. His average 20 fantasy points against Indiana this season in 2 games is just more of not a high enough usage, not a high enough minute situation for Lopez to really taking all that seriously at this point in the season. So I don't mind it, but you can do better there. Brooklyn and Miami, obviously Miami getting a little bit healthier with Whiteside back. We saw him come out and play just 17 minutes last game. I think we're going to kind of see them take it slow with him back. With that being said, I think you can obviously look at Kelly Olynyk as a high upside guy yet again. Played 31 minutes in that last game. Shot very well from the floor, 50%, went 15 and 12. Obviously, I don't know how much I expect the 3 steals and 2 blocks to come alive again, but it is another good spot against a team that does turn the ball over quite a bit. Obviously, we're looking at Brooklyn allowing 111 points per game, bottom 10 in 3-point percentage allowed, bottom 10 in field goal percentage allowed. Olynyk is obviously a great target that we can look at here in this spot. Have no problem going back to Josh Richardson. He's going to continue to log a ton of minutes here against a Brooklyn team. I know the price is high, but the guy's averaging 37 fantasy points per game over the last 5. The minutes continue to be in the upper 30s. Price doesn't really phase me all that much in this matchup against Brooklyn, who obviously are a struggling defense. So got to keep pounding away. With Waiters out, Tyler Johnson's been drawing the start. We've seen Wayne Ellington get some run as well. Tyler Johnson's kind of that guy who's probably going to flirt with around 29, 30 fantasy points tonight. We've seen him be above 29 in each of the last 4 games. No issue with him in any format here on tonight's slate. Ellington's obviously the kind of the cheaper price guy there if you want to go that route. A little bit of a lower floor, but if he gets hot from 3, this is a guy who obviously can rack up a ton of fantasy points. He's taken 10, 10, 12, and 8 3-point attempts over the last 4 games. Great matchup tonight against Brooklyn, who are allowing opponents to shoot 37% from 3. So Ellington's a guy that you can take a look at. Outside of that, it's just kind of the main guys here. Dragic's been banged up. Not quite sure if he's 100% healthy. Not sure if the minutes are going to be there. He's played 30 in each of the last 3 games when he's healthy, but haven't really seen the upside out of him this season. If you're building a ton of laps, I don't hate it, but once again, he just really hasn't shown it. On the Brooklyn side of things, I don't mind going here. It's not a spot that I'm really completely in love with. Rondé Hollis-Jefferson continues to be the guy that I like to target the most, especially on DraftKings where he's a bit cheaper. It is a good spot here. Obviously, the rebounding help will be there with Whiteside back, but he's not on the floor enough to kind of make a huge difference. Miami ranks 21st in rebounding on this in the year. We look at them. Defensive efficiency stats have kind of gone down against opposing bigs this season. That's mainly just because they've been without Whiteside. They've been without James Johnson. He's been banged up for a little bit this year. So they've had some trouble, but definitely don't mind targeting the front court here. I think you can get some good exposure. Karis LeVert is questionable for tonight's game. Obviously, if that sits, we could see some of the other guys pick up a little bit more minutes, like Alan Crabb, Damari Carroll, possibly some Joe Harris. But obviously, Carroll and Carroll's the guy that we have probably the most interest in here. Mintz has kind of been a little bit up and down of late, but he's got that potential at his price. There's probably better options to go with on this slate, but if you need them, I don't hate the idea. Outside of that, don't have a ton of interest in this Brooklyn side. Moving forward, Milwaukee and OKC, good spot here to kind of target some of the studs. On the Milwaukee side, obviously on the back-to-back, Giannis worries me at his price a little bit. First game this year where he's been under 40 fantasy points. That's pretty crazy. Obviously no one did that last year, scoring above 40 fantasy points in every game. He had that stretch going in here. That's not the case anymore. He did play OKC earlier this year, put up 43 fantasy points against this top 5 defense, top 3 defense even. I'm not really looking to use a ton of these Milwaukee guys on the back-to-back. I think there's better options at their price, better guys to build around. Middleton, going to see a lot of Robertson here in this spot. It's just not a matchup here where I'm really thrilled with Milwaukee. I think Bledsoe's the guy that you can take a look at in GPPs tonight just because he has that huge potential. Obviously 5 steals last night, but he's been breaking off monster games, and we have seen OKC slide a little bit against opposing point guards over the last 10 games. So Bledsoe's the guy that I'll take a look at. I don't have a lot of interest in Henson here. Just a tough matchup going up against Steven Adams in this front court. I do have interest in the OKC side quite a bit here. I think you can attack all their 3 stars in all formats. Westbrook continues to give you a very solid 50 fantasy point floor, averaging 1.8 DraftKings points per minute over the last 5 games. Usage rate right around 34%. The assist rate has gone up over the last 5 games to 57%. He's just like such a quality guy to build around tonight. For me, it's going to be Westbrook. I know, obviously, Anthony Davis, DeMarcus Cousins are in good spots, but for a guy who's averaging over 60 fantasy points in the last 5 games, it's kind of hard to ignore him. Didn't have the greatest outing against Milwaukee last time out, but definitely a good rebound spot for him here. Going to be looking his way. Paul George is another one. He's quietly kind of picked up some of the slack. He's a little bit cheaper from the Durant options tonight, from the Giannis options at the small forward position. We've seen the upside out of him. We've seen a couple of 50 fantasy point games. I think still below 8K on DraftKings, still below 9K on FanDuel. You can continue to look his way. The minutes are going to be high. They're going to be there. He's averaging 37 over the last 5 games. So once again, going to be going back to the well there. You can take a shot on Melo and GPPs at his price. Like, he's still pretty cheap. We've seen a little bit better games out of him. He's going to get you around 30 fantasy points, and that's kind of about it. Steven Adams is the guy we consistently have a lot of love on this show for. Went out there and put up 39 fantasy points in 23 minutes against Toronto. In this spot here against Milwaukee, I'm going back to the well with centers against Milwaukee. Bottom 5 in defensive efficiency against a position. They're 27th in rebounding. Look at Adams. He put up 34 fantasy points the last time out against Milwaukee in 26 minutes. At 6,300 on DraftKings, definitely going to be looking to go back to the well. He's 74 on FanDuel. He's obviously kind of creeping out of that great mid-range tier and into a higher price, but still very much worth it in this spot. As always, not really too much to kind of get excited about outside of those 4 on this OKC team. Moving on here, Dallas and New Orleans, 2 poor defenses. Obviously, we look at the New Orleans Bigs in such a great spot here, but we also have to look at Dallas as well. Dallas is a team that's been kind of pedestrian. They don't flash a ton of upside outside of a few guys. When we look at really who's leading the way here, it's been JJ Barea, 1.20 fantasy points per minute over the last 5 games. Usage rate's been around 24%. Assist rate's been up. Once again, I have no issue with using JJ Barea in any format. Just still cheap, still plugging around and getting you right around 25 to 30 fantasy points. He's flashed a couple bigger games too. In a matchup against a New Orleans team that's allowing 111 points per game, allowing opponents to shoot 37% from 3. I think we could fire up Barea there, especially on DraftKings. At shooting guard eligibility. FanDuel, it's a little bit trickier because he is a point guard, but still don't mind him in that spot. You can go back to well with guys like Wes Matthews. I know he's cheap. I know he doesn't, bring a lot to the table, but for a guy who can get you, 25 fantasy points in this spot, I think you can use him as well. But obviously Harrison Barnes is, I think, the guy that we have a lot of interest in just because we know the minutes are going to be there for him. A good spot against New Orleans, who do struggle against wings. We saw Barnes drop 42 fantasy points last time these two played. So Barnes is the guy that I have a little bit of interest in. Outside of that, front court, I do worry about Maxi Kleber there. He's played pretty well of late. Obviously, put up 40-plus fantasy points against Toronto. He's been kind of slipping back down in terms of minutes. Dirk's been a guy who's kind of taken over the front court role here. He's averaging 28 fantasy points over his last 5 games, has put up 30 fantasy points in each of the last 4. I don't mind going here. Obviously, this New Orleans team, Dirk is smart enough to not foul out against these two bigs. Dirk's a guy obviously going to have to struggle and kind of battle for rebounds, but for the most part, I mean, should be able to come away with, getting some decent shots up and getting some offensive roles, and his minutes have been back up in the higher 20s of late. So Dirk's still cheap enough for you to kind of take a look at. Outside of that, this Dallas side, really don't see a ton of upside with the rest of their players. On the New Orleans side, though, obviously, I have no issue with building around Anthony Davis or DeMarcus Cousins tonight. I prefer Davis a little bit here. We've just seen a little bit more upside out of him at a power forward position where there isn't a lot to love on tonight's slate. So definitely don't mind kind of going that direction. Cousins has been solid. Obviously, both of them produced in that game against Brooklyn. Obviously, the double-double potential is there. It's just the price tag mainly for DeMarcus Cousins. I know he put up nearly 60 fantasy points last time out. Like I said, don't hate it in GPP. He's going to be going other directions in cash. We saw both these guys nearly come with 60 against Dallas last time. That's just their potential. Not a good front court defense at all. They're not a good rebounding team, so this really kind of draws everything to go kind of go in Cousins and Davis's favor. So the only other guy that I really have a ton of interest in is Drew Holiday. Continues to play really well, even with Davis on the floor. A little bit pricey, but for a guy who's shooting 52% over his last 5 games, been around 35 fantasy points per game. This is another good spot against Dallas, who middle of the road defense, especially against opposing backcourts. Rondo, obviously, a guy who put up, 25 assists last game, scored 2 real points, and scored, 48 fantasy points. I mean, the minutes have been kind of all over for him. I don't mind taking shots in GPPs, but it's just hard to trust. I know the recency bias obviously just says plug him in because he put up 25 assists, but everything could come back crashing down tonight. So not something I'm super thrilled with, but you can worth a look in GPPs. As far as anyone else goes, usually I'll take a shot on each one more, but on a bigger slate, I'll be going some other directions. It's not a bad spot for him, but I just don't think he gets the job done on tonight's slate. So that's about it for New Orleans. We got Phoenix and Sacramento here next, 210 total. Sacramento 2.5 favorites. Obviously, with Phoenix back, we saw kind of their backcourt play go down with Devin Booker. Obviously, the usage rate is going to be very high with him leading the way. I have no issue using Booker on tonight's slate. I think he's obviously healthy enough to kind of get back and get you where you want. He played 34 minutes last time out, put up 48 fantasy points. So I would say he's fine. Against the Sacramento defense, it's allowing opponents to shoot 47% from the field, 38% from 3. Booker's obviously very much in play. Put up 35 fantasy points last time these two met. Not great, but only played 28 minutes. Was a blowout. So one thing to consider there, but I have no issue going that route. And I don't think a lot of people will use him. TJ Warren kind of started to pick things up as he went down the stretch there with Booker out and kind of need a little bit of a transition period. I have no issue going back to the well with him. Obviously, against small forwards, Sacramento's been pretty average this season. Mentioned those shooting numbers. Warren's a terrific mid-range shooter. I think you can go back with him. As far as the front court goes, it's not anything all that appealing because we've seen kind of Chandler get some minutes when they're not on a back-to-back. He kind of plays enough to kind of limit everyone else. We've seen Monroe kind of pick up some minutes of late. Played 27 against that first game in Memphis, but is kind of a DMP here at some nights. So I don't like going here on a 9-game slate. I'm going to be looking other directions. I'd rather use cheaper guys. Len's intriguing in GPPs because we've seen him play a little bit more minutes even with other guys back, but still not that great for me to kind of go with. But it is a great spot. Sacramento's also bottom 5 in rebounding, bottom 5 against centers. So it's kind of up to you in terms of what your comfort level is. But for me, not really going there on a 9-game slate. Sacramento obviously have some interest in some of these guys here that can get hot. George Hill, Buddy Hield are two of the backcourt guys. Even though we've seen Sacramento kind of go with some different lineups here and there, keep an eye on that. Buddy Hield obviously has plenty of upside in a matchup against Phoenix, who are allowing 112 points per game. Hield's a high usage GPP option on this slate. Floor is not high enough for cash games. When you look at the usage rate over the last 5 games, it's been Zach Randolph at 31%, it's been Buddy Hield at 25%. With De'Aaron Fox out, obviously guys like Garrett Temple, George Hill, Richardson, Frank Mason, these guys are all kind of cutting into each other's minutes. So do keep an eye out on the starting lineup if we can get that in time. Otherwise, for me, it is Randolph. It is Hield still. I know their minutes are going to be in that 25 to 30 range. I know the usage is going to be there, so I have no issue going with them. Willie Cauley-Stein has continued to play really well. Once again, going to be going back to the well on him. He's averaged 23 fantasy points in 28 minutes in 2 games against Phoenix. He's shot 50% from the field. He's been above 30 fantasy points, been above 35 fantasy points in each of the last 3 games. So another good spot here. Once again, have no issue going back to the well in this spot. Moving on, Golden State and Charlotte. Golden State 11-point favorites. Not worried about a blowout here. Start with the Charlotte side. I think if you want to get exposure here, you can obviously take a look at Kemba Walker. His price is pretty cheap. Hasn't really shown the upside much of late. Outside of that Milwaukee game, he's kind of been around 25 to 33 fantasy points. I don't hate it. Put up over 40 fantasy points last time these two met. Didn't shoot it entirely well. It is a decent spot here if you're kind of looking at game stack this one to use Kemba. Outside of that, it's kind of tough to get excited. I mean, Nicholas Batum's been playing heavier minutes of late, but really the production has kind of been scattered. He's another one where if you're kind of looking to game stack this one, kind of want to build around Durant, maybe get some exposure to this Charlotte side and hoping this game stays close and just becomes a back and forth affair. That's kind of how I'm using them. We saw Dwight Howard struggle against them last time out. I think that could be the case again here, especially against a Golden State that is going small, using more Jordan Bell at the 5. That could be a little bit troublesome for keeping Howard on the court. Also been a little bit of foul trouble of late for him as well, so I think Howard's going to be off the radar for me. Guys like Kid Gilchrist don't have a ton of interest in tonight. Him, Marvin Williams have been guys that have been kind of just secondary role players in this offense this season. It's just not really all that appealing. I think you can kind of just look more at the backcourt. You might see Jeremy Lamb gets a little bit more run in this spot. They do tend to go small, but not worthy enough for me to kind of take shots in GPPs. On the Golden State side of things here, like him here tonight, don't love him in this spot. Obviously when you look at Charlotte's struggles this season, it's been mainly against point guards. It's been against small forwards. So obviously you can take a look at Durant and kind of look to build around him. Once again, I like Westbrook. I like building around Harden still tonight, but Durant still 30% usage rates. Obviously the rebounds have been great. His blocks have been phenomenal this season. He's averaging 1.35 fantasy points per minute over the last 5 games. Durant's a guy that, once again, we can look at, put up 70 fantasy points last time these two met. That was without Curry, so do note that as well. Curry's still out for tonight's game. He has that potential. His price is down a little bit on DraftKings. He's 10-6, so once again, going there is no issue with me. Klay Thompson, coming off a down game against Utah, was relatively consistent. If you want 30, 35 fantasy points, I don't mind it in this spot. Charlotte's been decent against shooting guards. They've been a decent 3-point defending team this year, but Thompson's obviously a guy that you can look at in this spot. Outside of that, I mean, it's kind of tough to get excited. I know Jordan Bell played really well last time out. I mean, had 7 assists, had 13 rebounds. Guy who has some potential. If you want to take a shot in GPPs, that's fine with me at 4,700 at DraftKings. Not the greatest spot, but yeah, overall, I mean, I can see the appeal here. As far as looking to other guys on this Golden State team, it's kind of hard to really get going here. Iguodala's, a cheap option you can consider. 4,200, 20-25 fantasy points is viable. Again, the fact that he's playing about 25 minutes. He did play 29 minutes against his Charlotte team in a similar situation last time out, put up 29 fantasy points. So he would be the other one to consider. Obviously, Draymond's a decent option as always, who can produce across the board. Coming off, nearly back-to-back triple doubles, missed out on 2 rebounds, 2 assists last time against Utah. He's got that potential. Could be lower owned on tonight's slate. So overall, sorry, on here. Good spot to target Green. Last game of the night, taking a look at Lakers and Clippers. Potentially big news to kind of shift the slate here if Kuzma does sit. He's questionable for tonight's game, but we'll start with this Clipper side with the away team. Still dealing with the usual injuries here tonight. So Austin Rivers, the guy, was god-awful last time out. Clippers were just god-awful last time out. Go back to the well with Austin Rivers. It's a good spot here against a Lakers team that obviously struggles against opposing point guards. When we look at really, the rest of the Clippers team, I mean, it's still Lou Williams. He's still seeing plenty of the usage in this team. I think overall, when we look at anyone else, there's not a lot kind of going around. It's Lou Williams, it's Rivers, 29, 32% usage rate. Montrezl Harrell's averaging 16 minutes over the last 5 games at a 27% usage rate. Outside of that, I mean, no one's really seeing over 20%. That's the issue here. Obviously, DeAndre Jordan is an intriguing, center option, but for me, it's just kind of Rivers. It's just Williams. It's just Jordan. It's just the studs because just none of these guys are getting enough run. They're not getting enough usage or getting enough minutes to kind of contribute. I mean, Teodosic is a guy you can consider. He put up 28 fantasy points, but I want a little upside at 5K from that. So that's kind of the issue with me, in using these guys. So outside of that, it's the main 3 for me. And then we can move on to this Lakers side, who potentially could be without Kuzma tonight. And they're already without, Lonzo Ball. They're already without Brook Lopez. So taking those 3 off the court, we see the usage. It's Jordan Clarkson, it's Julius Randle, it's Brandon Ingram. Those are the guys that I'm looking at here tonight. Clarkson's obviously going to be a popular play. He was moved to he was moved to point guard in FanDuel. He was, up in 7K range. So averaging 37% usage rate with those guys, with Kuzma, with Ball and with Lopez off the floor, 37% usage rate in 113 minutes. Randall in 90 minutes, 29% usage rates, 1.06 per fantasy points per minute, 1.17 fantasy points per minute for Clarkson. Brandon Ingram struggles a little bit. We look at his fantasy points per minute go down just a tad. Obviously, Clarkson's and Randall's go out. Larry Nance is obviously going to get plenty of run here, as seeing backup minutes to kind of he's going to see backup minutes to Randall here, who will play some majority of his minutes at the 5, will play some minutes at the 4, but we'll see Nance get plenty of runs. So these guys are all intriguing options. I love the Lakers tonight. Going to be building around really all 4 of those guys, Clarkson, Randall, Ingram, and Nance if he plays. If Kuzma does play, obviously I still think these guys are all viable options. Larry Nance will not become a viable option for me. I'll still look and take shots on Randolph. Usage rate still pretty high for Clarkson. And also weird, when you put Kuzma back on, Randall still has a 29% usage rate. So going to be going back to the well plenty much with him in these spots. Clippers defense has obviously been dreadful this season. Going to be targeting the Lakers with a lot of guys tonight. Make them part of your core, especially if Kuzma sits. So it's going to be it for me. You can head over to DaveFantasyCafe.com, check out cheat sheets, GPP article for tonight's slates, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday.